Dear listeners of the Female Guides Requested podcast, happy Wednesday and welcome back to another great episode. This is your host Ting Ting from Las Vegas, and our guest today is Taylor Fragomeni. Taylor started climbing in the Adirondack Mountains of Upstate New York in May of 2011 and moved to Southwest Montana shortly after. She has 12 years of competitive and commercial route setting experience and a decade of instructing, guiding, coaching experience. Taylor often works with coaches, route setters, and guides to streamline their training plans to balance the physical demands of work and play that allows sustainable long-term progress. Her coaching style is highly collaborative. She sees herself as a supporter and educator who empowers each individual to become an expert on their own athletic journey. Taylor was my movement coach and helped me to write my own training plans. It is always fun to chat about climbing with Taylor. In this episode, we focused on principles of how to train for your climbing goal while you have a physical demanding job. We also talked about how to help intermediate climbers get better with their movements and keep climbing fun. People who are interested in Taylor's service can visit her business website, Ting Ting Climbing, or get in contact with her via social media. Links to those resources are in the show notes. Now, let's dive in.
My name is Taylor Fragomeni. I founded and run my business called Tangent Climbing. I've been coaching for and instructing for close to a decade now, I guess, which is kind of crazy to be able to say. I I've also have even more experience route setting. So part of what we're talking about today is training and balancing that with a physically demanding job. So even though my guiding experience is more limited, I did that in my earlier 20s when I could get away with just beating my body up. The balancing of it, the route setting is also really difficult. So a lot of the same principles apply, I think.
Awesome. Yeah, so I just like to let the listener know that I found Tay online because I was looking for a coach for myself to improve on my movement. You know, as a climber, you're never satisfied with getting better. And so she gave me a lot of, she watched the video. I hope that from the video you have watched, I actually did make improvement.
I think so.
So she watched my video, and she gave me quite a lot of good insights and things I can really see for myself. So I'm just today, that's why today I invite her on the show. So I want to learn a little bit some trade secret from her that so I can also use on my guiding, and also talk a little bit about things that we would. She just mentioned about how people to train when they have a physical demanding job like guiding or even route setting. Yeah, so maybe I'll let you take over from that. For I'm still having problem about my own training because right now, well, I just passed my busy season, so it was pretty tough for me to have a personal time to do my personal climbing, not mention night training. So what's your, I know that you have worked with some other guides and stuff, so what's your take on that?
Yeah. I think that makes it really easy to jump straight into one of the points, which is having to be really flexible, like you said, with a job like guiding, or even route setting for that matter. You have heavier weeks and you have lighter weeks, right? Or you might have months where you're working a ton, and prioritizing training or being able to even get training in is going to be too much for your body. So I think the first thing is just like being able to be flexible with your schedule. So that could look a number of ways. I think the the main thing is, maybe having some backup plans of like, okay, if this is too much today, like I'm going to do this instead. Or it could also be zooming way out and looking at, your schedule over the course of a year and saying like, okay, I know I'm really busy in these months guiding and probably won't be able to prioritize my own climbing and my own training as much. So maybe that becomes like an automatic like maintenance and prioritizing recovery type of phase. And then you hit it harder when you're less busy in the guiding season, right? So that I think is a definitely a really important thing to keep in mind, because there's value in consistency, and with physically demanding jobs, sometimes you have to just be able to listen to your body and say like, okay, what do I actually have time for and energy for right now? Which can be hard. It takes changing schedules around for sure.
Right. So you mentioned about being flexible and then also kind of have more like a long-term perspective instead of just
Hmm.
like, okay, this is what, but I think sometimes I don't know other people, like for myself, I just like, there's like this fear of like, okay, right now I'm guiding a week straight.
Hmm.
Right. And then I also talk with other guys, just like, how about their training? And everybody just like, well, maybe at least you can say, just hand on the fingerboard for maybe like, do a protocol for maybe like half hour. Or some people will
Yeah,
say, maybe get on some, try a hard problem because then it can make the training time a bit shorter. So then the recovery is a little bit faster. Yeah.
totally.
Okay. So, but then the thing is, sometimes I just like, oh, I really don't want to do anything because I'm like
Yeah.
out in the element. I remember one time I talked with you and then you say that maybe sometimes you just rest.
Yeah. Which
And
again, you're just handing me segues here. It's so perfect because
okay,
that's
great.
the other
Yeah.
thing I was going to talk about is like
Uh-huh. Yeah.
sometimes prioritizing rest and recovery is the move. That's like sometimes that should be the priority, and that could look a number of ways too. And it could look like, when you do sessions, making sure that you're warming up and cooling down well so that you can have a really high quality session and you're setting yourself up for success in your next session, right? But it could also look like saying like, oh, man, I'm so wrecked. I don't want to do anything. Like, I'm just gonna stay at home and maybe I'll like stretch while I listen to some music or whatever, or read a book and stretch or whatever your thing is. Um, and again, like being able to listen to your body and be like, okay, what do I actually need right now? And honoring that. I think sometimes it can be really hard because our brains, like the way the human brain works, is we want habits and we want things to be consistent. And so we can get pulled into either direction of like overdoing it or underdoing it. Um, but part of my like overarching coaching philosophy is just understanding that like, there can be all these like rules, air quotes rules around like what you're supposed to be doing or what you should do. But at the end of the day, it's just a giant experiment on yourself of being able to say, like, okay, if I back off, actually, maybe I prioritize mobility and recovery and rest, and I just take care of my body or I do gentle movement instead of going to train. Like, how do I respond to that? And understanding like how it all links up. But there's no blanket um, prescription for what you should be doing. And I think becomes that's true for everyone, but then it becomes even more complicated when you have a physically demanding job and you're trying to balance having time for your own participation in the sport where you get to prioritize yourself.
Yeah. So I think sometimes for example, I mean, I certainly, like you said, I have seasons. So
Hmm.
I certainly have some slower season and some busier season. And but one big fear of me was just like, well, if I don't do something, would I say detrend,
Mm-hmm.
right? So just like, how much do I need to do? Just say maintain. So then at least
Yeah.
I don't feel like I'm losing some progress at the previous low season that I accumulated.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is definitely, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. The key there, I think, is to find the minimum effective dose of like, okay, if I have been training in this way, how infrequently can I continue to do this thing and hold on to the gains that I've made? So that again is an experiment, right? You might start with like, okay, what if I do this like once a week? And then if you're holding on to your gains, you might go down to like, let me see if I can do it once every 10 days and hold on to it. Can I do it every other week and hold on to it? And then you can kind of from there like fine tune what you need in order to maintain. But on the flip side of that, I think it's also important to note that like it's okay to have fluctuations in your strength and your like what you're training, and allowing things to kind of ebb and flow a little bit can be really important too. Um, you're always going to be able to get it back, you know? So if you're not if you're not like totally stopping everything, um, you're going to hold on to some of that strength, right? And strength tends to stick around a bit longer than something like endurance does. It also takes longer to build. Endurance takes less time to build. So just being able to kind of weather the ebbs and flows a little bit and accept that, like, you know, if I'm super busy and I'm feeling really burnt out, maybe it's okay to like let things slip a little bit and then build back up from there. The more solid of a foundation you have, the easier that's going to be too. So allowing yourself to just sit in that and be like, okay, yeah, like I've slipped a little bit, but you know, give me a month back of like not being busy and I'm going to be right back to where I was. And I think we see that with experienced athletes and people that have a really deep training history can generally like what we call off the couch. They're like off the couch level is really high still, right? So it's like over time you'll still see that upward trend. Um, but it's good to remember that like ebbs and flows are natural, progress isn't linear. All of those catchphrases that we have a hard time accepting a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, definitely like I think I understand. Just like we jokingly say, okay, today is low gravity day, and sometimes you
Yeah.
feel problems like easy high gravity day or low gravity day, and so we all have
Totally.
that fluctuation. Just accept that. So some premise we were talking about. Okay, look long term, and
Hmm.
then accept that today you are struggling doesn't define the whatever your efforts kind of not
Totally.
effective. Yeah. And so
Yeah, and
I'm
having
curious.
patience in
Go ahead.
that too
Yes.
is like having
Okay.
patience in that is hard because you're you know, I think we live in a society where we're so used to like the instant gratification and like I want the thing now and like I can't allow myself to backslide or slip or like make mistakes. Um, but if you can like be patient and remember that the long-term progress is the goal, then you'll get there one way or another for sure.
Yeah. And then you mentioned a couple times, just like just now you were talking about as you need to do some like experiments, right?
Hmm.
Because I assume that it's because you need to kind of understand your body. You need to know how your body react to different type of training, how long this effect's gonna last, and all those things. So
Hmm.
kind of curious about like, so obviously when we do experiments, we are trying to find questions and answers. So what kind of questions should we ask for ourselves so then we can design the experiment?
Yeah, I think you hit on one already, right? Which is like, how does my body respond to these different types of training? Everyone has a different like genetic makeup, right? We're going to be predisposed to like some people can build and hold on to muscle really easily and some people can't. And some people are naturally more powerful and some aren't, right? So might be more inclined to like endurance type activity. So I think that's one is like, how is my body responding to the physical training? But really, that's only part of the puzzle, too, right? Because it also comes down to like, what do I have the energy to sustain? What can I keep up with consistently that feels doable? Um, and what I probably should have started with even is like, what's your goal? You know, what are you trying to accomplish? Because that should really inform like a lot of the decisions that you're making too. I think in climbing, a lot of the time we get so sucked into feeling like, oh, I have to like be hammering my weaknesses constantly. I have to like, oh, I'm bad at this type of climbing. I'm gonna like really hone in on this and get better at it. And that process is really important. It's equally important to take a step back sometimes and be like, well, what am I actually trying to accomplish this season or this year in the long term? Like, if I am primarily, I've kind of been going through this process myself recently because I've spent the last few years working on my weaknesses extensively. Um, and I'm still just better at the things that I'm better at, you know? So it's like, if my goals, if my goals are, you know, predominantly around like not very steep sport climbing, I don't need to be training on like bouldering cave problems, you know? Um, so making sure you're lining up your objective with like your training with your objective too, I think is really key. And then mentally, like what can you handle too? I think that's another piece that we don't talk about enough in climbing. So the question could be like, what's going to allow me to sustain like the motivation that I need to keep up with this? Um, what like if we look at training load, it's made up of like the things that we do. So it could be like V points that we climb in a session or what or the weight that we lift. But the other piece that we ignore really often is the other like pieces are like the stress in your life and like what's going on mentally. Like it's all stress to your body. Like exercise is stress, you know, conflict, like interpersonal conflict could make your training harder and it's like more load on your body potentially. So honoring that as well, I think is really important and gets missed so frequently. So it's
Yeah,
like what?
so
Yeah.
definitely. So as you know, so as physical training, it seems like everybody can finally somehow design something, right? Because they lifting weights or uh, getting better. Like now you can stick the move before you can stick this move. Uh, but that mental part of like how to evaluate and how to gauge that, it's like a little bit tricky.
It
Right?
is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you were talking about goal setting, right? So um,
Hmm.
I I was wondering, like, so, like, goal setting, like, how specific you need, and then how reasonable is like a goal. But people probably have various goals at different phase, or maybe the in overall they just like, wow, I want this goal, long term goal, the medium term goal, and short term goal. So,
Hmm.
uh, what kind of goal you find it most effective? Like, how specific does it need to be like a specific route, specific type, or that specific, or it can be a little bit like more like not as defined.
Yeah, I think once again, like it can really depend quite a bit. So, different people find different types of goals to be motivating at different levels. So, I always joke constantly that like a lot of the time when people ask me questions, I'm like, well, it depends. And this is where it
Right,
comes back. This
definitely.
is where it's not the answer anyone wants because they're just like, no, just tell me what to do. And I'm like, well, I don't know what you want to do. I know for myself, having a specific route in mind helps a lot because I get most inspired by like movement and like the flow that's required on specific routes. So um, I might have like a long-term goal of a specific climb, but then I'm gonna work backwards from there and say like, okay, what would be good climbs to do on my way to doing this route? For me, that works really well. But it can be different for everyone. I mean, really, it's I think one of the things that is true for most people is that you can set those long-term goals, but they're almost like a set it and forget it sort of situation in the sense that you set it and then you work backwards on like what do I need to do to get there, and then your focus generally is going to be more um your immediate focus is going to be more on the short-term goals and like building up to that thing. But you don't want to entirely forget it and like lose direction either. So having some sort of plan, I think, can be really helpful. It's all a balance. I think everything in life is a balance for the most part. It can be hard,
Yeah,
and different things work for different people for sure.
definitely. And I recall that one time, maybe back when you was still in St. George area, that
Hmm.
you ran a cohort for, I don't know whether it's summertime or wintertime training.
Yeah.
How long was that cohort? Remember, 6 weeks?
So they're 12 weeks actually.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so I generally do one in the summer and one in the winter. I started out with the summer one because living in St. George, like obviously, it gets
It's
really
too
hot.
hot. Yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's the time where everyone's training down there if you're staying there for the summer. So I ran the first one in the summer, and then up here in Bozeman is kind of the opposite, right? People are training in the winter more likely. So I've been doing that. I'm actually working on just converting that into a program that people could just do whenever they want because, those, I think if we're thinking like Western US, like those seasons make sense, but in other places it might make more sense to do it other times. Or if people want to start it like a month earlier, a month later, that can be really nice. But yeah, it's a 12-week program.
Okay, so in that 12-week program, so how many people in the cohort?
It varies, but I usually cap it at like 12 to 15 people.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah.
So, um, so do these people interact with each other, or you always overall it's like one to one kind of thing, though?
It's kind of a little bit of a hybrid. They're usually like they're allowed to, or it's not allowed to. It's like it's set up such that they can interact with each other, but a lot of the time people don't, um, which is also fine. I think if I like adjusted it to something where it's like okay, every week we're gonna hop on a call and see how everyone's doing with their training and talk about it. I would like to do that at some point. It's just something that like right now I haven't really had um, the time for because I have a lot of other calls each week. Um, but yeah, it varies.
Yeah. Then I'm curious. I guess what I'm trying to get is I remember this one of the cohort you ran that there's
Mhm.
also people who has physical demanding job. So I was like wondering what was your approach with them, like as an
Yeah.
example, because we talk about some principle. I asked some random questions, but I think maybe for listener it would be kind of nice to have a kind of more organized flow for you to say have this particular person you design something for them, or maybe adjustment in the middle with their
Hmm.
feedback and everything.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so part of that program as well is that like it's a pre-written program, but I will adjust things for the individuals as they need as well. So the what you're talking about is like the extra cohort that I kind of formed a second group that was like, okay, this is for like the route setters and the guides and like, people that are lifting a lot at work or like whatever. Um, so with that, there were two major things that I was focusing on. One was like making sure the volume made sense. Like you touched on this earlier, but uh, generally we're going to have a harder time recovering from a lot of volume versus like high intensity. So that's one thing to think about. Another adjustment I made to that program was that I transitioned a lot of the exercises, like the strength training exercises, to being isometric. So you're holding a position instead of moving through a full range of position. Um, that is also because it's generally easier to recover from. So those are kind of things that I keep in mind. I also, with that program for everyone, but especially for the people with the physically demanding jobs, I put loads of resources in there about navigating the training. And people don't always look at them, but it's important to me as a coach to be like, here's why I'm doing the things that I'm doing, or why I'm giving you what I'm giving you. And now, like, you take this information and use it, take these concepts and apply them. So with those with physically demanding jobs, saying like, hey, here's how to think about load management, and like how you're progressing things and how you're scheduling things. Like if you have a lot of the people that were in it were route setters. So I was like, okay, if you have a really heavy route setting week, prioritize these sessions. If you're having a really light week, maybe prioritize this. So helping them kind of decide how to adjust their own schedule as needed as well. Or even like integrating things too. Like I think you and I have talked about this in the past. Like we're working on specific things like movement wise, and you're a route setter and you're forerunning, or you're a guide and you're climbing on like easier terrain. Like, can you practice those skills while you're climbing for your job too? So being able to like overlap can help too. And then the last piece too, being really efficient with how you're working as much as you can. So being able to say like, how can I reduce the load on my body doing my job so that I can put that energy towards my own engagement in the sport, I think is really big too.
Nice. So how do people say evaluate their progress? It's not like climbing is kind of funny, right? So the success of climbing is not just like, oh, now I can lift more weight for like 20 more pounds than
Yeah.
I used to do, right? So I think something, like I would love to think that I'm getting better,
Yeah.
right? But sometimes it's a little bit hard. So if I do like a self coach program to
Hmm.
kind of keep that in check. So
Yeah.
what's some tactic for people to feel like, oh, actually I'm on the right track, that
Yeah.
I should keep going, and yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, totally. I think, yeah, like you said, it can be really hard with climbing because even like the one system of numbers that we have to keep track of our progress, grades, are very subjective, right? And they're not,
Yes.
the further you are from like an average male body, the less accurate they become, right? So that's something that I think can be really tricky and can be a helpful guide, but it's also kind of like a take it with a grain of salt sort of way of tracking your climbing, right? So I think if you're someone that really clings to numbers, that can be great. But I would also, alongside whatever the established grade is, um, writing down like a personal grade. Or I also really like telling people about the RIC scale. This is something we use in route setting. That it stands for risk, intensity, and complexity, right? So Tone de Castillo developed this after like spending so much time trying to figure out what it was that made climbs hard. I believe he was looking at like hold type and distance of moves and wall angles, et cetera, and couldn't really find any sort of correlation. So he kind of was just like, okay, what about this RIC scale? Risk is like basically boils down to like what is like the mental engagement that you're asking of the climber. So it could be things like maybe you have to do like a really committing dynamic move like high off the deck, or maybe you have to stand on a really bad foot. So things like that are fall into the risk category. The intensity is just like pure strength, power, the physicality of the move, right? And then the complexity is the technical demands. So you'd give each of those a score from 1 to 5 when you're considering difficulty. That is given in like from the viewpoint in the context of the target climber. So like, risk for like a V3 climber is going to be very different from risk for a V8 climber, right? So I like thinking about climbs in that way too and being like, oh, okay, this route, like maybe it says like the established grade's 12C. Maybe for me it felt like 12D, and I'll write that down too. And then maybe I'm also thinking about the RIC. Like maybe it's a like 135, and I'll write that down too. And you can kind of notice like that gives you it's so hard to assign numbers to these things. Obviously, we all know that. But it can give you a way to kind of internally assign numbers that it's actually going to like help you keep track of what you're doing. So, I might notice that like maybe my grade's not going up, but maybe my depth of experience at that grade is deeper now. And I see that I have these climbs done that are really spreading a wider range of like what's being challenged on them. Maybe I'm not always on like the complex climbs. Maybe I've done some that are more risk heavy as well. Um, so that can be a good way to look at it. I think also like how long it takes you to send things is a good way to look at it too. Like maybe you're still climbing the same grade, but you're doing it twice as fast as you were before. Um, that's like a huge marker of progress that I think we miss a lot because we don't get to say like, well, I did the next grade, yay. But I think that can be really cool and satisfying too. I think the underlying tone here is like taking notes is really helpful. Writing things down because our memory is not always very reliable, even though we're like so convinced that it is sometimes. Um, and that's something I work with. I work with a lot of youth athletes on mental training stuff, and actually like sent them notebooks and was like, I want you to like write about your cognitive like mental experience session to session too. And that's something we could even assign like an RPE to, like we would with strength training. If we're on that like 1 to 10 scale of like 1 is like I'm totally chilling, I'm relaxed, and 10 is like I'm freaking out, and like giving yourself an RPE for each session can be really helpful in that department as well, I think.
So you are saying that, okay, so, well, the journal doesn't have to be complex, but like maybe after
Hmm.
each session, then you kind of like jot down like how you feel, what you observe,
Yeah.
and how your mind is working, was working at that time, and then definitely right. I mean, as a guy, definitely trying to convince the clients that the climbing is not just a grade, but then so you would just offer a few different ways to ask this question, just like, hey, I used to be not able to commit to this move, and now I can commit, so that's like an improvement.
That's progress.
And
Yeah.
right, that's progress, right?
Hmm.
Or I can read the route better. That even though it has a more complex, so it's not just like straightforward beta. Now with a more complexity, I can solve this problem, even though it's the same grade
Hmm.
that they're marking. Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's progress. Yeah, I mean, it's not just like, okay, now I can hand down and say that 10 millimeter edge
Yeah,
longer.
totally.
I mean, that's
Yeah,
obviously
people love to latch
progress.
on to that. Yeah, it's
Right,
obviously progress. But I think what ends up getting lost a lot of the time is that people only think about the physical training and they only think about the things that they can track. And they totally miss out on all the other pieces that are important for climbing performance. And if your goal is to climb harder grades or whatever, not even harder grades, but climb things that are more challenging for you in whatever way, um, you can have all the physical strength in the world, but if you can't apply it on the wall, it doesn't matter, right? I think
right.
we all know that that's not the only thing that matters, but it's so much easier to latch on to that, and then we neglect like the mental aspects or the technical aspects or the tactical aspects, which to loop back even is like, and when you're in those really busy seasons, if you feel like, oh man, I'm exhausted, like maybe there's maybe there are ways to work on those things that feel more approachable than doing a lot of physical training. So it could be like, okay, let me like really do some reflecting on what my mental game is like climbing. Do I need to work on that? Um, Let me watch some climbing videos with a really like critical eye and see how different people engage with the same types of climbs. Things like that, I think, get undervalued a lot. And they don't require any physical effort, which can be really, but you're still working towards your goal, right?
Definitely, especially
Yeah.
especially if we develop that. I mean, right, climbing we have visualization, right? So we
Hmm.
even develop the critical eyes to be able to analyze what's wrong, what maybe not what's wrong, but what can be better.
Hmm.
Then potentially, then we can tackle the newer route a little bit easier in the long run.
Totally.
Okay.
Totally. Especially if you have something that's like a multi-season project, for instance, and you're like, okay, I have a
Yeah.
video of myself climbing on this. I know what the beta is. Like going through the visualization process is so helpful. And this is something I have my youth athletes that I do the mental training with. We do this a lot. I always call them mental mock comps, um, where there's some randomization basically, where I'm like, okay, like pull up a random number generator, and like this is the style of the climb, and this is how high you got on it, and they're actually going through the process of thinking about like, okay, if I'm in this situation, what emotions are going to come up? How, and then how do I like use these tools that I have to navigate that in a way that's going to still allow me to perform. And so far, they've all found it really, really helpful. And we do little variations on it constantly. But stuff like that even can be really helpful. You know, we like when we're trying to red point something that's hard, we all know that that's a really emotionally difficult process for most people, right? Like projecting is all fun and games until you get to the point where you're actually trying to send, and then you're like, okay, it's getting real now. Now we have to deal with the pressure, right? And that visualization process, especially when we're including things like what feelings are coming up in that process, we almost get to like we get to pre-process some of it, right? And then when you're actually in it, it becomes a lot easier to
So
navigate.
basically, just like prepare when you are not on vertical yet.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that allows you to be more efficient ultimately in your process, even like thinking like, okay, if we like really blow up efficiency to the scale of like my job's really physically demanding, like how do I get a high degree of efficiency in my personal climbing that's going to allow me to get more diverse experience on the rock and help me work towards my goals, right? If you get really good at the game of executing and being able to send things, like stick, you have more energy to climb on other things that day, right? Or you can like
Definitely.
get through more projects in a season. And so it's like it again always comes down to like what it is you're trying to achieve and do. Like I don't want this to sound like everyone's goal is to like project and climb harder, because
Mm-hmm.
that's not everyone's goal, and that's totally valid too. But in that in that context, like thinking about the efficiency is really big too.
I think that apply to a lot of different contexts, right? So when we say that,
Yeah,
oh, we want to get stronger, in the meantime, we want to waste the least amount of energy,
totally.
right? So,
Yeah.
so definitely can not just climb harder route and climb better, or even climb, say, longer stuff.
Hmm.
I don't know. So, I think efficiency definitely is crucial here.
It's so key. Yeah. I think about that constantly with route setting, especially because like it's just so physically and mentally demanding, honestly. And so you're like, all right, how do I like use as little energy as possible while I'm doing this
Mm.
thing so that I can then it all feeds back, right? So I really briefly mentioned load management earlier. Um,
Yeah, I love to hear
yeah.
more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I think one of the biggest mistakes people make when they start strength training, even if it's like you have experience and you just haven't done it in a long time, is they go a little bit too hard at the start. And what happens is they either get burnt out, it's too much to keep up with, they get injured, right? It's like we don't want to get caught in this cycle of really pushing, pushing, pushing without a foundation and then getting hurt. And then it's like getting injured when your job is physically demanding is even
It's
worse.
yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
Because you're like, oh my God, now this is impacting like my income and I can't like go do the thing that I need to do to survive. like that's so hard. So avoiding that as someone with a physically demanding job becomes twofold important. Um, so I think one of the biggest things, and I've had to repeatedly learn this, I've made this mistake so many times, but making like really small changes to building a foundation are really important. So if you're like, okay, I really want to like work towards this goal and like, I really want to do like, I want to start incorporating these lifts. It's like, okay, maybe like we either start, maybe you add all a few of them at the same time, but you're starting really at a lower level where you're like, okay, I'm going to do an amount that I like, I'm pretty confident I'm not going to be sore from. Like, I can definitely just consistently make progress. Instead of going like, it's again, it's like such a hard balance because yes, we want to listen to our body. I think most climbers tend to overdo things instead of underdoing them. So saying like, what's the smallest change I can make and making that change and then giving it a few weeks before you make another change, right? So maybe it's easier if I just give an example, but like I've been dealing with some elbow tendonitis recently from, my decade plus of route setting. I have loads of scar tissue in my right elbow. It's ridiculous. But it got bad uh, over this past winter when I was training a little bit more heavily, and I didn't feel quote unquote like I was doing too much. I was like, I'm keeping up with my training. I feel like I'm lifting heavier. I'm climbing harder. Like I feel good. But then I hit this point where like it just came out of nowhere, and I was like, wow, I can't climb. It really hurts to climb. And I think what happened was I was climbing a little bit more, yes, but I was also like deadlifting heavier than I had in a while. I was doing some like tension block training. And so it ended up being a lot of load on my elbow, even though individually those things didn't feel like too much. So what would have been a better plan and what I've been doing since then is to just kind of like allow myself to have slower progress a little bit and say like, okay, instead of adding all these things at once. I'm going to do one at a time. I'm going to do 2 sessions at this load and like make sure I feel good for 2 sessions in a row at a load before adding more weight. Instead of being like, oh no, I feel good. I could do more. I could do more. um, like, yeah, you want to feel that, but like, don't indulge it every single time. And I think sometimes we tend to push too hard and then we're risking that injury. That can be really hard to balance too, but it's just again, it's an experiment and writing things down is going to be really helpful. That's something I've been trying to be more consistent with too lately is just like taking notes and being like, okay, last session I did this many sets and reps at this weight. Like I'm not going to increase sets and reps and weight all at the same time, right? I'm going to pick one of those things, or I might just do the same thing at the next session in order to give myself that slower, more consistent progress. And what happens with that too is you end up with a much better foundation. And then, when you do have periods of time where you're like, I can't really train, it gets easier to get back to that place that you were at. It's kind of like raising that baseline, and having that foundation also allows you to better capitalize like going forward on you're gonna be able to hit most likely a higher level of strength than you would if you were just like, all right, I'm going straight into max strength. I'm gonna like try really hard to do the thing straight out of the gate. Like quick gains tend to go away more quickly, I guess is the summation of that.
Yeah, you also mentioned, right, strengths take longer to accumulate, but it's also taking longer to go away, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like this kind of, I don't know, this maybe not rules, but things just like, well, you're just gonna slowly improve that you can keep that a lot longer, right? Yeah. So
Yeah.
what I've heard from what you have said, things like, all right, yeah, you want to overload, but not overload crazily at the same time in all aspects, like intensity and the load or length of the time. But then you need to understand that this way help you to keep a very solid foundation that if you need to pause onto the cruising mode or maintenance mode, in the future you will still easier to get back on your foundation than and move upward from there. Is that
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah. And I could also say, like, I think a metric that everyone can use to help guide this process a little bit is that you shouldn't be like walking away from sessions feeling like you're totally trashed. So like climbing until you like can't hold on anymore, like while that could be valuable every once in a while, and there's some mental aspects involved in like practicing that. While that can be valuable every once in a while, if you're walking away from every session feeling like, man, I did all the things I possibly humanly could today, all you're doing is putting yourself in a recovery hole that is going to most likely take like 2 times as long to get out of, at least. You're also not training efficiently at that point. You know, I think a really good example is like if we're doing a limit bouldering session and we start to feel that like our power is getting tapped and like we're like, oh man, I'm regressing on these moves now. Like, just stop. Stop trying to work at this max strength power zone at that point. I think there's value in like being like, okay, I'm gonna like drop my level now and like extend out into a cooldown or whatever. But once you're working past that point, you're no longer producing gains. You are just making it harder to recover. And you're most likely like not having as high of quality movement either. And then you're also at the same time starting to pattern like poor movement as well. If you're someone whose movement falls apart when you get tired, which is most people. So that's a really good guide if nothing else, think about like walking away from your sessions feeling like I could come back tomorrow and perform well.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing too. I mean, I have to keep remind myself just to walk away too. Just especially you say, well, I'm not just not making gain. I'm actually could potentially hurt myself because I might need longer recovery time. I might reinforce like bad movement patterns. So
it's just frustrating too. And you're like,
exactly.
And then you're like, well, that gym session sucked. Like, I don't want to come back tomorrow.
Definitely.
Like, give yourself a chance.
Yeah, so it's kind of, I can find a parallel example in guiding. It's like, I'll just say, well, it's occasionally if you have an epic trip, and then you can have very good story to tell, you feel proud of yourself to push through, but you don't want every day to be an epic trip.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's, again, all a balance.
Right, definitely. And then another topic I would like to ask. So as a guy, sometimes, client will ask us about, what can I do to improve my movement and skills? And obviously we don't have, say, you as a coach, right? So you have to say, for example, your youth program. So you have these kids for a long time, right? So you can design a program, but a lot of times it's like, well, I have you for, say, a day, right? On the guided day. And then there's other skills I have to teach. And then I was like, and now you are asking me about like a movement advice.
Yeah.
And
it's so hard.
Right? So I'm just kind of curious because sometimes as a guy, we also teach our new guys how to give people a movement advice. So what kind of big picture thing that we should look and then because I say stop beta spraying, right? Because that's not very
Yeah.
useful. And what kind of like a big principle thing that maybe it's easier for us to get with a limited amount of time, and then maybe can
Hmm.
help them to hopefully build a good foundation if they keep those advice in mind.
Yeah, totally. I think I'm curious if you agree with this too. I think a lot of the time, like newer people come into climbing and there's this huge misconception that it's all about upper body strength, right?
Definitely, yeah. And
Yeah,
then maybe
yeah.
it's like, oh, my finger strength.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly. We always go straight to that, right? And I think
yeah,
even experienced climbers fall into that trap. And so the first place I generally go with newer climbers is like, let's talk about how to use your lower body while you're climbing. Just to kind of like really cut that off at the start and be like, actually, no, it's not about upper body strength. It is a little bit, but I think where most people fail is not using their lower body. Our lower body gets like way less fatigued over the course of the climb than our upper body does. I think the thing that's tricky about it and that reinforces this feeling that it is upper body dependent is that we get so much more biofeedback from our arms
the
and our
upper. Oh,
fingers
okay.
and hands
Hmm.
because they get tired faster. And so we're like, oh my God, I like need more endurance. I need more finger strength. I need more upper body strength. Um, which really, if we can efficiently send as much force as possible into our lower body, pretty quickly you're like, actually, no, I don't need that necessarily. I've definitely coached a lot of people that are just so strong in their upper body and are just getting like booted off of things that they quote unquote should be able to climb with the amount of strength that they have, but it's because they're not using their lower body. um, so as far as like introducing that to people that you're guiding or newer climbers in general, like I think the first analogy that I usually go to is thinking about like walking up a ladder. You know, that's something most people have done. You're not pulling your way up a ladder generally. You're stepping up it, right? And you're using your hands for balance. And I'm assuming too that most of the time that you're guiding, you're on like lower angle terrain.
Oh, not
That
necessarily. Yeah,
not
because
always. Okay.
but usually if I have more advanced client, well, sometimes they still probably don't initiate the movement on lower body. I can't claim myself
Yeah.
always initiate movement
Yeah.
on lower body. So that could still be a very good advice
Hmm.
too. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's step one is like a ladder analogy or thinking about like squats. If you have people that have some strength training or like athletic background, like most people have done a squat at some point in their life, right? Or thinking about like a one-legged squat type thing. And you could even play around with like not everyone can do like a full pistol squat, but like what if you like had everyone stand on one foot and like go down to where they feel comfortable and then stand back up and going like, okay, that's the feeling that you're going for on the wall. Like that muscle engagement is what you're looking for. So I think that can be a really helpful like demonstration for people to see. Um, Another one I think that can be helpful is, and the fun thing with a lot of these is like you can just do them on the ground, and then people are like, oh yeah, this clicks. This is something I've done before. Like this makes total sense, and then they get to apply it on the wall. But having them stand with like their feet together, um, and saying like, okay, imagine if I like gave you a little push right now. Like, how hard is it going to be for you to not like take a step and not fall over? You know, where you can actually like give them a little push depending on the vibe and be like, and the terrain that you're in, obviously, and be like, see, like it's really hard to like be stable when your feet are close together and there's some sort of force being applied, right? Versus like if I'm standing with my feet apart in a more like stable position, uh, and someone like pushes me, I'm probably going to be able to resist it pretty easily, right? So that can be helpful too, I think, from like a foundational standpoint. That's not to say that we're always going to have 2 feet on the wall, obviously, or we're always going to be able to be in these wider stances, but I think that can be a really good and approachable like way for people to think about creating stability in their lower body while they're climbing. And that's easy to like pull into like, okay, what about flagging and like balancing on one foot and noticing that like if you're reaching a hand out, I keep gesturing like people are gonna be able to see me. I talk with my hands so much. Like, it's always really funny recording podcasts. But if you're like reaching a hand out and standing on one foot, generally like your other leg is gonna go in the opposite direction, right? So I think that's something that can be a helpful on the ground like demonstration for people to do too.
Yeah. So how about so it's definitely I think those are cool fundamental like using basically just trying to find your balance and what's the easiest way to find your
Mm-hmm.
balance. And then I know that you were talking about squat because the newer climber I think somehow their knee don't bend
Yeah.
that much because they wanted to
Mm-hmm.
pull rather than maybe just bend down a little bit and then stand up and things definitely. So how
Mm-hmm.
about like say some common mistake that you with newer or maybe it could be intermediate climber because nowadays
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of gyms. So there will be some clients that come out. They actually can climb like 5'10" and
Yeah.
stuff. Right. So how about some like common things that you might observe from this crowd?
Mm-hmm.
Potentially you see that on the wall. Like what can we develop like a good eye, critical eyes? Now I'm using
Yeah.
my gesture
I like
in the
your
video.
gesturing too. Yeah. I like that. Critical eye. Um, yeah, I think I just always like tend to pull it back to that like lower body engagement, but obviously at an intermediate level, that might be where you're more focused on like, what if you just have one foot on the wall? How do we like so then we might think about where our hips are in relation to like and introduce that idea of like shifting your hips in order to make moves easier. Um, but I think at that point you could also start talking about body tension too. Um, it's always tricky, right? Because it's like you don't want to overwhelm people with too much information at once. So I think like picking like something like that can be really helpful. But yeah, body tension is good. So I might ask questions like, do you feel like you're pushing through your foot right now? Like what's happening there? Um, so Power company climbing popularized this drill called rooting. And it's called rooting because you kind of think of it like being a tree, right? So you're like, okay, I'm like, if you think about your toe being like a root system and it's like growing into the rock, you're fully rooted in there. Um, and you're able to like flex around it, right? Like a tree can sway in the wind, but it's in the ground, you know? So trying to think about how do I create tension all the way through my toe can be really good to start once once a climber understands like, okay, this is where I'm standing on my shoe. This is like I'm foundationally working on like climbing with my lower body starting to think about like how much tension can I put through my foot doing these different things and adding that hip like balance, hip shifty like balance element I think could be helpful too.
So okay, yeah. So body tension because I think that's a little bit hard for me to observe because I can't quite
Mm-hmm.
tell how hard they are pushing on that
Totally.
foothold. So probably
It's
have
really
to
hard to
be.
observe. Yeah. You kind of have to like ask. I think that's the best way to kind of go about that is like, okay, like what are you feeling in your body right now? And like, are you focusing on this? Or like reminding them while they're on the wall, or like saying, hey, have you ever thought about this before? Um, but I'll give you one that's actually easier to see too.
Awesome, yay!
Since we said critical eye. um, so body tension being more of a like asking questions, kind of just helping draw awareness too. But what we can think about like body positionally, if we're thinking about like teaching climbers to think about where their hips are in relation to a movement, looking at like the stability of their moves, I think can be really helpful. So, for instance, like generally newer to more intermediate climbers want to have 2 feet on the wall all the time. Um, but they'll end up in situations sometimes where that's not possible, right? On these harder grades. I think especially on sandstone, like there's just not as many options for for feet all the time. So saying like, okay, like this foot's gonna have to come off. And if they're like thrutching to a hold and then a foot's flying off, and generally like your body is gonna find the balance point on its own. But something that I'll point out to people is like, okay, see how like this foot popped off and immediately was like swinging into kind of a back flag position because your body's going to find that balance point to stay on the wall. That's a good indicator that that's probably where you wanted to be before the move started. Of course, that's not always the case, but sometimes we just have to throw to things and swing around a bit. But trying to help people recognize that too, like how we create stability that's going to set us up well for the move. If a limb is like flailing around after we do a move, like where's that balance point that we could have preemptively gotten into to do the move? Does that make sense?
That makes sense. That kind of remind me. I read, I forgot where, but people talking about, you are climbing from position to position,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, and during this process, so you're talking about just like, oh, now your limb starts to like, do something to help you to gain balance. And obviously, when I look at Yang Gombre, was just she she did that to absorb the energy, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
but for like most average climber, they probably just like the body just like, oh, I'm like gasping for air, so I need to get to the balance point. So,
Totally.
so that's the key what I'm talking about. I don't know whether you agree
Mm-hmm.
with that. We are actually moving from position to position, kind of thing. So, that kind of made me feel like, oh, okay, if we know our balance, like the position we are most in balance, then we can anticipate instead of just moving our limb crazily to gain the balance. We could
Mm-hmm.
pre-place, for example, to that position.
Yeah, absolutely. I That's something I think about a lot with limestone climbing, especially because a lot of the time, like the holds aren't as good. You need to be able to like walk your feet up the wall and get into a position where when you grab the next hold, it's already going to be like somewhat optimal. Whereas if you're like throwing yourself to this like super precise, like weird hold that's not very good and is very directional, like then the odds of you being able to like sustain that over the course of an entire climb is not going to be high.
Yeah.
There's a cat in my room. She's getting mad. She wants to leave. She
Yeah,
just
I
like
got.
punched the door.
Yeah, I have two cats too. They are the best climbers.
Yeah, for real.
Awesome.
But yeah,
Yeah.
I used to have a friend that well, I didn't used to have a friend. I have a friend that used to say like he thinks of movement in like an it's either like A to B or A to Z. So thinking about like I'll explain. So A to B might be like, okay, I'm in this position, and then to get to the next hold, I'm just gonna like stretch and throw, and like my body will find the balance point, right? A to Z might be more like, how do I set up so that I can like smoothly move through all these positions to get to the end point instead of so like kind of breaking it up a little bit more. That A to Z might be like, okay, how do I set up for this move? Whereas A to B might be like, get to the handhold first and then figure it out, if that makes sense. I thought that was a fun way of looking at it. I was like, oh yeah, totally. Like, and that could be like static or dynamic. Like sometimes you brought up Janja Garnbret, like she's so fun to watch because she is in such control of like her momentum. So even though it looks um like oh it's like really dynamic and like etc. I mean that's comp climbing in general, but she's really good at finding the way through these comp type moves. Um that's like best leveraging all of that, right? She's finding the A to Z of each movement. And being like dynamic doesn't necessarily mean that you're not in control, you know? So I think that that's an important distinction to make as well.
Yeah, watching her, I found that with her coordination move, I just like, wow, it's not really about the speed. It's
Hmm.
sometimes I feel I'm looking at her as like slow motion into this coordination move, but it's
Yeah.
pretty accurate. Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's kind
And
of
being able
cool.
to like, she's so good at like, she does that like scorpion type thing all the time of like really what that does is like you're flicking off the momentum. And if you watch like when you watch her do moves like that, what's happening is that like her upper body is kind of more or less staying where it is, and all that momentum is getting sent into like flicking it off with the lower body. Which is a really useful skill to have too. But I'd consider that to be like a little bit more advanced, I think.
I think
And it
that's
can show
very
up in big and
advanced.
small ways. Yeah. Some people just naturally are good at it, but it takes some work for most people, I think.
Definitely, yeah. So definitely feel like some people are super aware about their body, so they're somehow
Hmm.
it just look like their body can just work, right? And then
Yeah. I think that's
okay,
one of the a lot of the time people feel like comp style movement like is not helpful for rock climbing, but I tend to kind of disagree with that. I think if you're looking at everything as like concepts, that concept can be applied in all sorts of terrain. Like that's something that
yeah,
I've pulled into climbing on like really technical limestone climbs even of like if I have to go like kind of more dynamic to a hold, and I know that I'm gonna have a foot off the wall, I might like flick my foot back to get rid of that momentum as soon as I hit that hold so that my body's not coming away from the wall and I'm having to rely on fingers to keep me in, you know? It's pretty interesting.
I I would say that I totally agree, and this is that remind me that I do have another question now here.
Great.
So so I a lot of time I totally agree because I think that gym climbing or con climbing actually my commercial gym is not like there's a lot of con problem. Occasionally they have some con moves in quotes. But
Yeah.
for me, I feel that inside climbing is not that different from outside climbing. There's definitely a little bit different aspect. Outside climbing, you have more noise to read the terrain or read the
Hmm.
holes, right? So maybe you feel more exposed to the element, right? So, but
Hmm.
I think that's irrelevant to the movement. So the movement itself, I should be the fundamental principle should be the same. So
Hmm.
that's my take on so but a lot of people like my client just like, oh, yeah, outside climate is different, right? And then
Hmm.
they would say that. So usually it's because they don't have as much outside experience, so they can't climb as hard, whatever the
Yeah.
number is, as that client in the gym. My question is like, what's your suggestion for people to bring what they learn
Mm.
inside to outside so they can transform the knowledge they gain inside to outside if given that they know the difference of outside climbing which is other actual skills than
Yeah.
movement, yeah.
Yeah, I think the number like step one obviously is just being aware of like what your body is doing on the wall. And the cool thing with the gym is that we have like so much opportunity to climb on different styles of things and like different challenge levels. Like there's endless amounts of climbs, right? So step one is like bringing awareness to that. I think another thing that I notice a lot is that I mean in climbing we're usually like, oh, I did the thing, so I'm done with it now. Especially if it was a more challenging thing, we're like, well, I don't want to try it again and fail. Like,
So like unsend this thing.
yeah, I don't want to unsend this. But I think in the gym, especially, but this could apply out well outside as well. But it's maybe like more accessible in the gym is taking that like more of a mastery approach and being like, okay, I did this thing that was challenging for me. Let me repeat it a few times and see if I can climb it better or differently. Um, or, like pay attention to like, okay, this move felt like a little bit weird. Like, can I play with the speed I'm doing the move at or how much tension I'm applying or like whatever. Maybe it's different beta. Um, so it comes down to really trying to understand like what works well for your body and you have to just pay attention to it, and build that into your practice, as instead of it just being about like getting the next grade or like sending the boulder, what if it's about like doing it to the best of your ability and understanding how your body works on the wall? That's what the best climbers do. I think one of the cool things about climbing is that there's there's not necessarily like it's the best climbers are good at understanding what their strengths and weaknesses are and then adapting to the situation that's presented to them, right? So it's not about like fitting into a very specific box. It's about understanding yourself and how to then apply that. The gym is just it's easier to practice that in, I think, in a lot of ways. So that's a good way to kind of pull it out, pull it into the real rock.
Yeah, because I think the movement is movement. So no matter it's like outside or inside,
Yeah, and it
shoot.
comes from what you're used to too. Like I like people do more commonly feel like, oh, like climbing outside is so much harder. And like, yeah, there's some skills that you're more likely to gain outside than you are in the gym for sure. Um, but I feel the opposite. I've spent more time, even though I have like all this route setting experience, I'm like, think I've spent more time on rock still, and I feel way more comfortable climbing outside. I get rocked in the gym a lot of the time because I'm like not a strength and power climber. I understand this about myself, and that's fine. I excel in the more techie terrain, which the gym tends to have less of, unless you have setters that are really good at doing that. But yeah, it comes down to what you're used to and comfortable with too, I think.
Definitely. Thank you for answering all my questions. And let's talk a
My
little bit
pleasure.
about you. I know that you are right now in Bozeman,
Hmm.
coaching youth, right? So,
Hmm.
but you still have your own business, right? Tangent climbing.
Yeah,
So
that's still a
that's
bulk of like what I'm doing. Yeah.
oh, okay, yeah.
Hmm.
So, I know that you written program for power climbing for I see some like 512, 10 sleep, and
Yeah.
513, and then so
There's a
what
511 one too.
exactly? Okay, there's also
Yeah.
511. So what exactly is that? And then are you still planning to do other cohort, or what's your plan for your own business?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna run my cohort again, probably starting in June. I usually started at the beginning of June, so there will be some stuff on the Instagrams and my website to kind of give people info and the ability to sign up for that. But yeah, this 10 sleep program, it's pretty cool. Like, so I do some coaching for power company climbing as well. And last year, we all decided that we wanted to kind of create these more specific like trip prep programs is what they're called. So I have a lot of experience climbing in 10 sleep. We always joke up in Montana that the best climbing in Montana is in Wyoming. um, it's close by, and it's real. So I've spent loads of time there since I lived up here for so long. Um, so I wrote three different versions of a program that is designed. It's like 9 weeks long, and it's just designed to help people prepare to go on trips there, so that they're hopefully going into it like well ready to like achieve whatever they want to achieve on their trip. And me being me, it's very focused on the technical skills that you're going to need and understanding that. There's obviously strength involved as well. It is still training, but it's very practice heavy. So amongst all of the training, I'm very big on giving the why and like okay, this is why I'm giving this to you, and here are the other things to focus on besides just getting this physical adaptation. And then there's lots of resources in there for like tactics and stuff like that as well, and what you need on your trips. Um, yeah, it's pretty cool. And then Chris wrote one for Wild Iris because he lives in Lander. Uh, and I think there might be some other ones now too, but I'm actually not sure. But yeah, that one you can sign up for whatever. It's just kind of a do it when you want. You can either do it with like on your own, or you can do it with access to me as a coach. So yeah, I'm pretty excited about those. I think they're good. Seems like there's a good amount of people signed up for it already right now. Because now's about the time when like people are getting ready to go there for the summer or the fall or whatever.
Yeah. Actually, I've never climbed 10 sleep.
You should come up. I'll be there.
So I don't even know what the
It's so
climb is like
fun.
there. Nice.
It's so
Yeah.
fun. I love it there. Yeah. It's a beautiful canyon. Yeah.
So is most of your program on your website or mostly actually follow you on the Instagram?
This is really funny. I feel like it's funny to be like, yeah, this is my business. I am terrible at the business side of things. The best way to get information about stuff is to just message me on Instagram or fill out the contact form on my website. It's my website is not up to date right now. I've been working a ton the last couple months, and so I'm kind of like behind on the more admin type tasks like that. But that should be updated soon. The 10 Sleep program is just on Power Company's website, since it's through them. Um, Things that aren't on my website really lined out right now are like custom training that I do. Most of the people I end up working with for custom training are guides or route setters, or climbing coaches themselves. So it's not that I like don't work with other people, but that's kind of, I think, more of like a specialty for me. And then other than that, the things that I'm like most passionate about coaching wise are like the mental game and uh, the movement stuff too. So for movement training, like I don't have that on my website right now. Actually, it's on my list. It's on my admin list that is just always getting longer. And people can reach out if they want to do that. But yeah, the mental training, I've mostly been working with youth athletes right now, but I like working with adults on that stuff too. I think it's really valuable and it's like it gets so undervalued, but time and time again, when I've worked extensively with people on that those aspects, like they've started performing better like pretty quickly. So it's just very application based, like, okay, here's the science behind it, and here's how to practice it, or here are some actual like tangible tools to work through this. And I'm trying in the process of like putting together some like self-paced like online course type things, so that hopefully I can make that like as accessible as possible for people. And I'll probably do like a non-coaching and coaching option for that as well. But yeah, that's kind of the general gist, I guess. And I will hopefully by the time this episode comes out, my website will be more updated. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm
things are going to
curious.
slow
So
down.
I think for your mental training, it's a little bit new to me because I'm not aware of that. So
Mhm.
can you just maybe talk a little bit about like, say, what's your goal on the mental training and what kind of approach that you potentially take?
Mhm. Yeah, so overarchingly, people that come to me wanting to work on that are looking to perform to the best of their abilities and to have more fun climbing. I think it can be really easy to get sucked into the pressure and like to kind of lose track of what it is that we're like engaging with the sport for in the first place, which so a lot of the time we start with identifying that, like, why do you climb? Um, that's something that I think everyone should be able to answer. And it sometimes people can't. They're like, why do I climb? Like, it's not even fun anymore. I just feel stressed most of the time. Like, it should be fun most of the time? So, like, kind of coming back to why am I doing this? And most of the time, the answer is because, like, oh, I really enjoy the movement, or the community that forms around climbing can be so cool, or I love the complexity of the challenge that gets presented in climbing and the puzzle solving aspect. So a lot of mental training is being able to bring a lot of conscious awareness to what, like, to that motivation, that internal motivation that has nothing to do with how other people perceive you or what you should quote unquote be doing. So that's kind of where I start mostly with people. And then in in tandem with that, we often talk about confidence and how to build that, and expectations and what those look like in climbing, whether they're helpful or not. Um, we look a lot at like what we have control over versus what we don't. And then the practical aspects, uh, we talk a lot about fear management and how to work through that. Talking about applying like mindfulness techniques, and then like how to like bring ourselves back into our body and practice like being present on the wall, because we can't perform to the best of our ability if we're not present. um, so that's kind of the general gist, I guess. And then I'll kind of like, I will tweak things based on like what the individual needs and is curious about too. So like the order's not always the same if I'm working with people one on one. That obviously won't be the case building out this course. I'll kind of just hit all the points. But the summation, I guess, is like performing to the best of your ability, or and like having fun while doing it, so that you can keep like having this longevity in the sport and enjoying it, instead of it feeling like another job or something that's contributing stress. So that's I guess the short answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's
the
cool.
short answer that was preceded by the long answer.
I mean, I love your premise. Just like, perform the best
Thanks.
you can. But right, so definitely like in climbing, mental, everybody knows that mental is a very big part, but not everybody.
We don't like to work on it.
Right, so, and it's not like strength training or even technique, right? Mental training is like things that is less concrete steps to go on that route. And I'm glad
it's
to
different
see
for everyone.
right. So I'm glad to see more and more people trying to tackle that topic.
And I would even say, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I say I like that you have a component is the confidence building, right? Because I think I'm also sometimes struggle with people, because I heard this one thing. I forgot who said that. It's a climbing podcast, and they were just like, "Oh, climbing is so good at feeling bad."
I like that. Yeah.
Right. So then, even though they are actually do improve, somehow they don't collect that into their confidence building. And say, yeah. So
totally.
I kind of like that.
Yeah, something I find myself saying a lot. Like, I think this comes up a lot with my youth athletes. They're like, "Oh, it's so hard," and I'm like, "Well, it's supposed to be hard. If it was easy, it'd probably be boring, right?" And they're like, "Yeah, it would be boring." And then they're like, "Okay, yeah, this is supposed to be hard." My goal as a coach a lot of the time working with people on mental training too, and this is just a larger part of my coaching philosophy as well, but like I pretty strongly believe that everyone's the expert on themselves, and a big part of my role as a coach is to like empower people to believe that and be like, yeah, you can, like, I don't know. I don't have the answers. Like, you're the expert on you. Like, I can hand you these tools and this information, and then like let's talk about what your experience is and like how to custom fit things. And it's cool once, a lot of people, kids especially, like people don't give kids enough credit, but a lot of time once they understand the concepts, they're like, well, what about like this tool that they like just totally came up with by themselves based off the concept, right? And I'm like, yeah, try it. Like that sounds great. Love it. And it's so rewarding to be like, dang, they just took that concept and like ran with it, which is so cool. So yeah, everyone's the expert on themselves, and I think we get bombarded with so much information that it's easy to forget that.
Nice.
At the end of the day, it's just an n=1 situation. Like it comes down to what works for you.
Right. So yeah, so you look like your coach philosophy is like you're not telling people what to do, but you are helping.
I hate telling people what to do.
Right?
Yeah.
Helping.
I don't want to do it. Yeah. I'm like, here's the knowledge I have. Like, do what you will with it. I have authority issues. I don't like telling people what to do. It's a collaborative process. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that approach because I hate telling people what to do. And then I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it depends. What do you think? And then, I often answer questions like, it dep
Totally.
Sometimes people are
Yeah.
saying that, I just want you to tell me what to do.
Or you ask another question back, right? They're like, ask you something, and you're like, well, let me ask you this. Just to kind of help guide the thought process so they can come
Mm-hmm.
to their own conclusion and they have to look inward to be like, what am I actually experiencing?
Definitely.
I think that's really important.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I think it's
Of course, yeah.
it's pretty fun. We have so much laughter too, not just talking about serious business. Yeah.
Yeah, climbing's
Cool.
supposed to be fun.
Yeah.
I
So
can't take it seriously.
I mean, climbing is fun. That's why we're still climbing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or
If
should
it's
be at
not,
least.
yeah, right. If it's
If it's
not
never
fun,
fun, why are we doing it?
yeah,
It's a
yeah.
recipe for burnout.
Definitely this struggle, this frustration, but overall, it's like fun.
So fun.
Great.
I say serious fun a lot to my youth athletes, especially because like we want them to like have a great time at practice, and at the same time, it's like we got to put work in if we want changes to happen. So sometimes I like to think too about this transition from like, okay, before I step on the wall, I'm gonna like focus up and get serious and be in my body and be like, okay, time to like try. Um, but then like making it as fun as possible off the wall, like goof around with your friends, like be silly. I a lot of the time will when I like whip off of a project, we'll just like start laughing or make like really ridiculous noises because it just is such like a good like tension relief to be like, oh well, it got me again. Guess I gotta climb this sick route again. Oh well. Yeah.
So, all right. Tay, before I let you go, that do you have anything you think I missed, and then you want to add on to it?
I don't think so. I feel like we hit a lot of stuff.
Awesome. So, so let me say thank you again.
Thank you.